It's fair to say that the Manx fishing industry has had its ups and downs and certainly has been struggling in recent years. There does appear to be calmer weather ahead for Manx fishermen though, with fish stocks improving, good scientific knowledge and advice now available and renewed political interest in the value and opportunities Manx fisheries offer. Can we expect kipper or queenie wars with our neighbours, or is the new collaborative inclusive approach to fisheries management likely to land bigger portions on Manx plates? I'm joined this week by Peter Duncan, Senior Marine Environment Officer at DEFA, Jack Emerson, Sea Fisheries Policy Manager at DEFA, David Beard, CEO of the Manx Fish Producers Organisation, and fisheries scientist Isabel Bluer from Bangor University. I began by asking David about Isla Gale, a teenager who has won awards and praise for entering the fishing industry.
Yeah, well, she's been part of a fishing family on the Isle of Man, and was encouraged to go fishing on her father's boat early in her career, really, when she was sort of 13, 14. She always wanted to be a fisherman, as she wants to be called a fisherman. She always wanted to be a fisherman, and she really went straight into the training program that we had available, and also got the experience on one of the best boats on the Isle of Man. So she had a really good start to it, and has continued that interest. She's worked really hard.
And part, I suppose, of the purpose of this programme is to allow people to better understand the fishery. And maybe, Peter, if you could tell us what would be the prospects for someone, in their mid to late teens thinking about becoming a fisherman. What would you say to them? Would you say, yes, go for it, there's great opportunity ahead, or would you be a bit more cautious? As a civil servant, you're bound to be cautious.
Yeah, I would say that David's probably best to answer a question like that, but I have my own views of it. I think that the industry has changed dramatically over a very short space of time. It's really complicated and challenging in a lot of areas. To take one example, the squeeze that the renewables industry is putting on fishing areas, the requirements for compliance with the multitude of management measures and laws, even the technology, and running a business in challenging times, such as we've seen with COVID and Brexit, and trying to much of our seafood is sold into European markets, for example. So there's been some massive challenges. So it's probably a business for younger people who are quite dynamic and get go. But I think particularly on the island, as we'll discuss, we are looking forwards. The industry is looking forwards. And I think if we work together, then there is enormous potential for it. It is a fantastic industry in principle. The sea provides some amazing resources, and if we look after them, they will continue to provide those resources, and all we have to do is to catch them and make sure that they're still there for the future. But that does take an awful lot of background. So I think if everyone can work together, from the fishing, the catching sector, the processing sector, the managers and the scientists, as well as finding space for all these other activities, then yes, there is a future, but it requires absolute collaboration in what is a really complex sector.
And Isabel, I mean, obviously you're big on the science. You've been engaged in the Manx fishery now for, what will it be, 6-7 years, maybe
9
more?
years.
9 years, gosh. So you, as much as anyone, will have a good understanding of what's going on. But it's quite a complex task as a scientist, trying to understand what's happening underneath the water in a fishery, which could be being prosecuted over quite a large area. You only get to see sort of snapshots of what's there, and it's a complex job.
Yes, I agree. We have a lot of things going on in terms of survey work and research to help assist with those kind of things. So we have a research survey, for example, for scallops that goes on every year. But it's not just, so that's one that takes place in a research vessel. But more and more we're engaging with industry, and industry are helping with that science. So, they're a big part of the science now, which is a change from 9 years ago when I first started. So we have an industry survey that goes on as well for scallops, and that allows us to really collect additional information and see at a much finer spatial scale what's going on as well. And also, the fishermen get to be involved in the science and get to have a better understanding, so it makes it all a lot easier. And obviously there's a lot of stuff going on, not just with the scallop fisheries, but with the pot fisheries. We're getting a lot more fisheries dependent data, but a lot more fisheries independent research is going on in that area as well, to really try and help understand those species and try and help management as well.
Jack, then, maybe you, as the policy manager, maybe you could explain, for those who don't know, what actually do we catch in our bit of the Irish Sea?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of people will be aware that the main fisheries that get discussed on the Isle of Man are the king scallop and queen scallop fisheries. They are by far the most important to the local industry, the majority of boats, and contribute the most to the Manx economy. But we have the crab and lobster fishery as well, which are targeted through with pots, and also the whelk fishery that again is targeted with pots, and a lot of that product gets exported to the Far East as far as Japan. So we do have a diverse range of fish stocks that we do take value from, but there are other stocks in Manx waters that are also abundant and sustainably managed. And for example, the herring, haddock, the herring biomass is now well recovered following what a lot of people will be aware of as the decline in the 70s, and that stock there now is 2 or 3 times greater than what the scientific assessment would say was a sustainable amount of fish. So there are an abundance of fish stocks available in Manx waters. It's getting the fleet geared and to prosecute them and having access to the quota to fish for them as well. So,
and again, there's Dave. I mean, I think most people's understanding of what fishermen do is they catch fish, and fish have tails and scales and fins and things. But your fishermen, the Manx Fish Producers Organisation, doesn't really do much of that, of catching that kind of fish. It's more the shellfish that you're engaged with.
Yeah, I mean, the basic reason is we fish for what are called non-quota species, and they're the ones that don't have a quota set by originally the EU. And the reason for that being is that we don't actually have sufficient quantities of quota for the quota species such as cod, plaice, haddock, monkfish, all the sort of fish that you would eat in fish shops or restaurants and everything. We don't have quota for those, or very limited quota. So certainly the level of quota we got isn't enough to have a viable fishery and also to process it on the Isle of Man. And that's something that we really feel that is wrong. We're part of we have to be part of the UK quota pool for all of these species. So we have to be almost granted the permission to go and fish for those species with a certain amount of quota. And what we need is a fixed amount of quota for a long period of time, so that we can develop an industry based on those fish and based on that species.
How do you get the quota then?
Well, at the moment, it's largely based on what are called FQA units, and that's quota allocation, fisheries quota allocation. And we have very few of those. It's only that ones that we've bought on the open market over the last 20 or so years. But we're quite a small organisation in terms of compared to the UK, and so we can't outbid the UK other producer organisations when any quota does become available. So the only real access we've got is to be granted that quota from UK. There's a certain amount of additional quota available post-Brexit, and a fair amount of that was for the RSC. And we've seen practically nothing of that so far. And it's something that we've really got to, we have been working on to try and fix.
Mm. So Peter Duncan, then, this sounds to me like a department-related issue then. we know that the Fisheries Management Agreement gives the Isle of Man government the control over our 0 to 12 miles, provided that we discuss reasonably and behave reasonably with fishermen that have visited the island for many years. You know, so you can't just exclude them because they aren't from the Isle of Man, for example. But that would indicate, surely, that we could have our own quota regime. Why would Isle of Man government not want to do that?
So I can answer a little bit of that, but I think Jack's probably best for that. You're right in saying that. So originally the territorial sea, which runs out to 12 nautical miles from the island, originally we had the 0 to 3 mile area, and that was Manx territory, and then the 3 to 12 area was then negotiated, particularly with the UK, for all sorts of things, the seabed itself, the mineral rights, the hydrocarbons, etc. But because fish move and fishermen were never fixed in one particular place, then, as you say, the Fisheries Management Agreement was set up with the UK to help the Isle of Man, which has always been an independent jurisdiction, to engage with the UK and hence the EU. And that agreement helped balance the rules on both sides of boundaries and all of these things. And I guess what you're saying and the way the discussion has gone, that a lot has changed. The UK has left the EU. It's now an independent coastal state, and the negotiations for things like quota are now a thing that can be entered into, and obviously the Isle of Man plays catch up a little bit because we don't unilaterally change these things. So I think it's safe to say that we recognise that the world has changed, and the department is engaged with the UK in trying to bring the arrangements into the 21st century, and for us as an island with a significant territorial sea and fish stocks in it, to get a more equitable share of that as we see it. But that is quite a long process.
And Jack, then, this is something that you're actively engaged with.
Yeah, certainly, and also with David as well. We've worked closely on looking at what fishing opportunities are available post-Brexit, because obviously there was what they call the relative stability mechanism whilst the UK was in the EU, and the fishing opportunities were set and allocated between the member states according to a certain set of rules. The negotiations leading up to the Brexit period meant that there are additional fishing opportunities available, and that covers massive areas of the Northeast Atlantic, but actually there are significant additional opportunities available in the Irish Sea. And when you look at where these fish stocks are resident or transient, our territorial sea is actually home to a lot of these fish, and fishing activity occurs in it. And so we're working with David to identify what stocks of interest and what an equitable share would look like. You know, it's one thing to get the quota, but it's another thing to A, catch them, B, to process them, and C, make some money out of them, which is ultimately what the fishing industry would be interested in, as well as the sustainability and the science and the social aspects of it. So, yeah, we're working closely with David to pursue this, and the department all the way up through the government really are well tuned into what the priorities of the industry are and what the opportunities are ahead of us.
So, Dave, your members don't fancy getting engaged in kipper wars or anything like this, and blockading our waters to visiting vessels?
I think it's been
Some
talked
might.
about. No, I mean, what the key thing is, we do need to be able to diversify. The problem with relying just on the 5 non-quota species is that they're seasonal, and we have some periods in the year when we have no fishing opportunities, especially in June and October. So we also need to be able to protect ourselves from our own fishing activity as well. When the catch rates decline in the king scallop industry, for example, towards the end of the season, it would be good to be able to diversify into the prawn fishery. And again, that would be based on the fact that we would need sufficient quota to be able to make that worthwhile, and to be able to spend a large amount of money, which is what it would cost, to actually adapt the boats to it.
And I suppose that's a thing that, having been a fisheries minister, I know a bit about. But why do you need quota to be able to catch the nephrops?
Well, I mean, basically, if you don't have the quota, you're not allowed to fish. It's that simple. So we, in our organisation, we have about 60 tonnes of nephrops quota, prawn quota. It's not enough to be able to have a sustainable fishery, and one that you can invest in either as a vessel and certainly not as a processor. We would need between 200 and 400 tonnes a year,
and just
to do that.
Put that in those volumes into perspective. The nephrops stock to the west of the Isle of Man and the mud belt there is actually the largest population of nephrops in the world. And the scientific advice for the catches there range between 8,000 and 10,000 tonnes per year, and we reckon that about a third of that is actually within the Isle of Man territorial sea. And so, when David talks about 60 tonnes, just to put it in perspective, it is a very small amount of the overall opportunity. So, nephrops is one, herring is another, and then your round fish like haddock are a third sort of area that we're looking at. And we think we could pursue these with the types of vessels that we have at the moment, the types of vessels that David's organisation represents. It's just getting the quota and getting over that policy barrier, really, that we're working hard to get towards.
So, Isabel, I mean, it sounds from what everyone's saying here that our bit of the Irish Sea is starting to look a lot more healthy than perhaps it has done for some years. Is that scientifically borne out, or is this just a catching myth, or how does it work?
Well, we're very lucky here, certainly for our scallop species, that we've got very long time series of data, so we can look at how these trends are changing over the time. And you know, when you were minister, we had a very high level of, for example, scallop stocks around the island that were probably unprecedented, really. We hadn't seen that prior, and we haven't seen it again. But what we have seen since that decline from that initial boom is, with everything that's in place, so industry working together and government working together with us to collect the right, very detailed science, is that we now know that we're getting back into a much more better position for a lot of these stocks. But, some of it still is not at where we would like to be ultimately with those stocks. But again, it's quite spatially discrete for these areas. So, we're getting good recovery in the areas. We're getting good management to put in place so that we don't take too much from the areas. But yeah, it's looking more positive than it has done for a long time for those scallop species. But again, it's some of it is natural variation that we're still waiting for recruitment to come through. So the years when it was very good stock, sort of back in 2011, we had good recruitment for scallops, for example, across the whole island. So everywhere was good to fish. And what we've seen since then is we've seen spatial recruitment that's been very high in distinct areas, so off the west coast or off the east coast. But we haven't seen it occur at the same time everywhere. And that would really allow us to get back to that very high stock level situation. But the difference that's in place now is that we have, the science to monitor it, and we have the management in place to make sure it doesn't get taken back down again. So yes, I think, we are getting into a better place. And the more, as David says, that we can diversify into other fisheries, then it means we're taking the pressure off some of those key stocks and allowing them the time to recover as well. But yeah, the science is definitely there in place and showing that we're getting positive trends.
Dave?
Yeah, I think the other key thing to add to what Isabel's just said is that the management is now in place, that when we do get a large recruitment, we'll be able to manage it much more sustainably than we have in the past. The key difference being is that the number of vessels which are entitled to fish for various species, for example, king scallop, is now at the most appropriate level. I mean, when I first came to this organisation back in 2014, there was about 200 king scallop vessels, UK and Manx, entitled to fish here. Actually, about between 90 and 110 would fish for king scallops at that time. Now this season, you'll be looking so far since 1st November, there's been 33 vessels that are fished.
Gosh.
And the total that are entitled to fish is about double that. It's about 60 to 65. But of those, only about 50 to 55 are active vessels at the moment. So when we do get this increase in juveniles, which we will get because it is a cyclical thing, then we'll have the management in place to be able to cope with that. Prime example being is that, as I said, 33 vessels this year, and if you look back into November 2016, when there was a really big fishery off Peel, there was 88 boats fishing, and there was no catch limit. And now there's 33 boats fishing with a catch limit in place. So when we do get that recruitment, the management is definitely going to be in the right place, and those boats become profitable. It's really is all about economics, and we will get referring back to one of your previous questions. We will get young people coming into the industry when they know they've got a solid industry there, and they can make some money, which is what everybody, at least they want to be in a profitable industry. And I think we've got the management in place that when we do get that increase in stock, and say it is a cyclical thing, then it does look good. The future does look good then.
You're listening to Peter Duncan and Jack Emerson from DEFA, David Beard from the Manx Fish Producers Organisation, and Isabel Bluer from Bangor University. In terms of the 33 vessels that are fishing for scallops, how many of those are actually Manx vessels?
I think it's 22. I think it is 20. I think it's 22 that are fishing at the moment. Manx vessels, and it'll be 11 UK boats.
So that's a significant change from the proportions that we used to have, because it used to be primarily UK-based vessels with a smaller amount of Manx vessels, and now the Manx vessels are the much greater proportion.
That's the active ones. I mean, don't forget that with a catch limit in place, some UK boats, the larger ones, won't come here because the catch limit is not economic level for them. But I think I'm right in saying that of the 60 to 65 boats that are licensed and 50 to 55 are active, about 50% of those are Manx. So that's in the 3 to 12. And then if you look in the 0 to 3, I think it's 36 boats are licensed and 29 of those are Manx.
Okay.
So, it's in the 0 to 3, it is basically a Manx registered boat fishery, because the UK boats that are allowed to be in the fishery in the 0 to 3 seldom come here at the moment. So the 0 to 3 is pretty much Manx only at the moment, and we are looking after that. And with all the marine nature reserves that are in place there's about 50% of the 0 to 3 is protected against mobile fishing. This should be helping to increase the standing stock of adult scallops that are in the marine nature reserves, which then lead to more spat and more settlement, more juveniles in the areas that we can fish. So, I think we've got the management in place. We just need that recruitment to come. And this past year we had good recruitment in the Queen scallops in the Bangor survey. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yep.
Yes. And also this year, a lot of the boats are reporting that there's a lot of juvenile scallops around in most areas around the Isle of Man.
Okay. And Peter, then, this sounds as though, in some mystical way, the department and the Manx fishery generally seems to have worked miracles, because certainly when I was engaged with this, it was an incredibly difficult job to put a limit on the number of vessels that could fish. And certainly the thought that we would find that there would be more Manx vessels able to fish than UK vessels. This would have been an extraordinary thought, and that was only about 8 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, it takes time. It's been the second attempt, the second tranche of process. So the same process was done back in 2016, which reduced the number of boats that really didn't come here and therefore weren't dependent on it. And that process was achieved again. And I think it was done via the Scallop Management Board, which is an industry and government and Bangor board which meets and discusses the data and finds an evidence base for all of these things. And really the idea was proposed by the Scallop Management Board that the number of boats should fit the stock that was available so that they could all make a reasonable living. And I think the reason that we have, as we said, it's taken 30 years perhaps to get to this point, but actually the use of the evidence that's provided by Bangor, the sticking to a process and engaging with the other jurisdictions and doing it in a legal and proper way means that you can actually achieve these things because it's based on data, it's based on a logical process, and we've got to a point, I think, where, as David explained, it's looking better for the number of boats that are available. And I think, as Isabel mentioned, you've got to build up the stock to make it viable. You've got to limit appropriately the access and the effort of the boats that are in the fishery. And when you add all of those things up, then you get an increasing stock and fewer boats pursuing the stocks, and then they themselves can make a better profit, and that encourages new entrants into the system and makes the industry viable in the long term.
And Isabel, I suppose the thing that scientists maybe dread is when actually we start seeing boom times, and the pressure then comes on from the fishermen to say, well, actually we need to open this up because the fish will only be there for a few years, and once they get past a certain age, they're not going to be as valuable, and all the excuses under the sun come up for catching more and more fish. Presumably now you're reasonably confident that the way in which the Scallop Management Board works, that there are enough checks and balances in place to avoid those pressures, or at least limit the impact of those pressures.
Yeah, I think we have one of the best examples now of with the Scallop Management Board and everybody involved in it, of a really positive example of how management should take place. So the industry that are involved in that, then they're making decisions and recommendations to the minister. They're often based on sort of a series of guidelines, so we're not reacting to things. And the other thing is we've now got longer term management plans in place. Certainly for king scallops, it will be developing for queen scallops, and then for other species as well. So we're not just kind of like reacting to what's going on. We're looking to the future. We're looking at how we can make sort of steady changes to the fishery. But a lot of that is coming from the industry members of the board. It's not just us as scientists saying that, this is what needs to happen. There's discussions about this, and it's involving everybody. And really that's been the very key point to getting where we are with the fisheries at the minute in terms of the management. And yes, I think once we get that recruitment around the island again for king scallops and queen scallops, then, I am very confident that we're going to be in a place to manage that well now. But it's been a process of an evolving process. It's not come, all at once. And really everything has just come together with the long-term management plans put in place. The science has been there, and we've got a good history of that. And then the engagement from all sides, from government, industry and science, that we're all working together for the same reason at the minute. So it's good.
No, that is good. One thing that did strike me was I was looking through the weight and value of fish landed by species 2018 to 2021, which Peter kindly shared with me in advance of the programme. And I thought, gosh, whelks, wow, where did they come from? Because certainly when I was, I think, came back the second time as Fisheries Minister in 2011, there really wasn't much by way of a whelk fishery at all. And I noticed, looking back at some of the figures, there were the value of the catch in 2011 was about 200,000. By 2018, that had gone up to 1.2 million, and then it's tailed off fairly significantly since, so that by 2021 it was down to just 600,000, the value, and tonnages pretty much matching the change. Is this an example of a fishery that needs a bit more regulation, and maybe it was overfished back in 2018, and we need to be a bit more careful about the amount that we catch in that sector?
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, I guess the scallop fisheries are the ones that we would really consider data rich. We have a lot of data on those, both from the fisheries aspect and from independent sort of science as well. The pot fisheries are ones that are coming up to that same level. So, for example, we have a lot of spatial data for the scallops that we haven't had in the past for the static gear pot fisheries like whelk. But that is changing now. We're having IVMS coming in, and also the level of data collection that the fishers are providing is changing as well. So the idea from the science point of view, certainly the focus of this sort of period of our current 5-year contract is trying to get those pot fisheries up to the same level of data so that we can begin to do surveys and stock assessments on these species as well. So from our point of view, yeah, it really is getting the data there to have the same evidence that we have from the scallop fisheries. But probably Jack or David is probably better.
And actually, David, I mean, I know from experience the battles perhaps that go on between the static fishermen in terms of where they place their pots, and these incredibly well guarded secrets as to where they fish, and said secrets have probably been passed on from father to son over generations. You can kind of understand why people might be a little bit cagey about wanting to share too much data in terms of where they're catching, in case somebody gets a hold of a report from the department, and the next thing everyone's wanting to fish in the same place.
Yeah, I think the data is anonymised, so they won't know exactly which boat is fishing where when it's presented. But the key thing is you have to have data nowadays. You can't have a fishery without the science to back it. It's our duty to fish sustainably with all the species, and whelk is no different. I think really with the whelk, crab and lobster industry, it's getting to the right level of, again, number of boats, but also the number of pots that each boat can have. And I don't know if we know what the ideal number would be at the moment. So, but that's all developing as we're going along. I think the thing with the whelk fishery, especially in 2020, was that was one of the fisheries that carried on through COVID, and yet the markets didn't carry on through COVID. So there was a large amount of whelk stored frozen on the Isle of Man, and so that's slowly been processed and worked through. So processors wouldn't welcome a lot of whelk landings at the moment in a way. So whether that's down, whether there is a drop in the amount of whelk out there, I'm not sure. But certainly the amount of fishing has reduced. But that may be due to the stockpiling of the product in Manx processing.
And I suppose I've just beautifully given an example as to why you should not just rely on one set of figures to to manage your fishery. Peter Duncan, then, in terms of support for the fisheries sector, what kind of support is there available now? What does government do to support the sector? Obviously, we've discussed some of the management stuff, but what other things does the department get engaged with to help the fisheries sector?
There's a couple of points I'll make, and then I'll pass it on to Jack, and he can cover other aspects. I mean, I think a good example, and a rare example, but quite an extreme one, was the COVID situation, where government provided some monies to the fishing industry to take it through one of the most difficult times it's really ever been through. So that's a practical but emergency measure. And I would actually probably, linking back to some of the things that we've done, I think what government has provided industry and why we have got to the position we are in now is a mechanism for industry to deliver advice, recommendations of measures that they would like to see. And importantly, government has provided that forum and then enabled it to happen and delivered on some of those things. So I personally think that a mechanism for industry to direct fishery management and get involved in co-management is something that not all governments do, and it's something that we have done, and I think it's paid dividends because it's like a positive feedback loop. Once the industry sees benefits of engaging and sees that management can improve, then they're more inclined to get involved. And we have a situation, as evidenced by the folks sitting around this table, where government, science and the industry are working very well together. and that can't be said for everywhere else.
Jack?
Yeah, I suppose on the nuts and bolts of what support is available, I guess there is the fisheries grant scheme, and I think it's fair to say that has not been as successful as we had hoped. It was launched at the same time as the strategy in 2015, and it's a lot less on a per vessel basis compared to what UK vessels are eligible for, even before Brexit, but now post-Brexit as well. There is additional support schemes in the UK. One thing that I'm preparing to do in the near term is to revise the strategy, and I think a lot of people get bored of hearing about government strategies being rolled out, but I think it is really important for fisheries now that post-Brexit there is a clear route and direction of travel, and as part of that we will be looking at the fisheries grant scheme as well. You know, I've spoken to fishermen down in Peel at the hub down there, and they've made it very clear to me how it's not meeting their expectations or their needs. So we're going to be looking at that definitely. And one of the things we've done recently, you know, working again closely with David, is branched out and looked to other departments and organisations and seeing where they can help as well. So Lee Clark at the Isle of Man Maritime, which is part of the Department for Enterprise responsible for careers in maritime industries, we're now working more closely with them to make sure that there's support available for training and stuff like this. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but it's certainly going to be done. Yeah.
I think there's two aspects. Sorry, I think there's two aspects to this. When you say support from government, I think the one aspect we do have, which UK doesn't really have, is access to experts. Like we've got in this room, and also the flexibility to manage and also make decisions quickly. I'm part of the UK scallop working groups, and you cannot imagine the difference between, it's like chalk and cheese, between the cooperation you have here between industry and government, but also the speed of decision making, and the fact they can make a difference. I mean, that long-term management plan, for example, for the king scallops, it was I started a discussion paper off, and within 2 years we had a consultation, and we had a reduction in the number of boats and trying to get it to an economic level. So that is really positive. If you're looking at the financial side, we are definitely the poor cousin compared to the UK in terms of support. We get about a tenth compared to the UK vessels in terms of monetary support. That is a problem because we have an ageing fleet, and we've just scrapped two of our traditional boats, and they never fish again. The Venture again and Spavenmore both been scrapped recently, and that is just down to age. And the problem is with the fact that the industry hasn't been profitable in the last few years is the fact that maintenance is, it becomes more costly because you've got an aging boat. So we don't have access to those sort of things, which we obviously would like. And going forward, if we're going to diversify into other species, again, support for purchase of nets and new equipment, etc., and also in the processing sector as well, which we totally rely on. Without the processing sector, we would not have a fishing industry.
So those two vessels that have been scrapped recently, what sort of age would they be?
They're from the 70s.
Gosh, yeah. So these would probably have been herring boats converted to catch scallops.
I'm not sure. I think probably the Spaven was, but I don't know the full history of them. But yeah, from the 70s, yeah. Some of them would have involved in. I mean, they've been all over the place. Those two boats. They've left the island. They've come back to the island. They've been all over the UK. And a number of our other boats have. So they're not the only ones that are from the 70s. There's a number of other vessels which are from that decade as well, which are still fishing here. The trouble is that when you get a boat like that, it costs more to maintain it. So that in turn affects your profitability. So yeah, I mean that sort of support would be welcomed, and it's part of a discussion going on. There's also, as far as the processing sector is concerned, is possible assistance or whether that's an expertise or capital funding or whatever, to increase the amount of freezer space that we have on the Isle of Man, which is a limiting factor on our contribution to the GDP. if we had sufficient freezer space on the Isle of Man, we could increase the amount that we're exporting for sure. And that's probably we're probably going to need it, because if we're going to diversify into these other species, and also if we've got a greater share, a greater Manx share of the available catch from scallops, we're going to need better infrastructure on the Isle of Man.
And in terms of the overall value then of the caught fishery, Peter, I mean, what are we talking about?
I suppose it depends on how you measure it. There's the first sale value, or then there's the processed and exported value. But David might be able to speak better about the overall value. But I think if you total up the simple quayside value, then it's 3 million, 2 to 3 million, roughly.
But that's just the scallops, not the crab.
No,
lobster.
if you
King scallops is about 2.
Yeah.
On
So
the
about
quayside.
5 million-ish in total.
Yeah,
and then, of course, the processors get a hold of it, and that they work their magic, and the value significantly increases then.
Yeah, I mean the peak, it was talked about as being about 20 million, but it's not that now. You'd be talking about 7 to 8 million in total now. But there is that possibility to expand that, by quite a lot. With this increased Manx share, I said, in the king scallops and the queen scallops, and if we manage to diversify, yes, certainly the GDP can go up.
And in terms of government's investment in the sector, then, as a proportion of the 7 million that effectively feeds in, how much does the government grant scheme dish out on a year? Maybe Jack, you might have a better feel on that.
I've got an answer, but it's not a good one. It's £42,000.
Yeah,
is the total value of the fisheries grant. That has been increased in the past. For example, I think it was 2019. It was increased temporarily to allow for diversification. Yes. But at the time, there was, the diversification bolt onto that allowed for some purchase of equipment to go fish for other species, but it didn't really answer the quota questions. So
no, I think the value was an additional 125,000. I think it was.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. Yeah, it was before my time. But
yeah, but we'd, as I said to the minister at the time, but could we also have a cheque for $750,000 to buy the quota, so we can actually use this gear to go fishing.
Yeah.
And actually, Peter, then I mean, something like that. You would imagine if government were able to assist in buying quota, that's then effectively allowing the fleet to bring significant additional value in on a much longer term basis. So is that something that governments can do?
It's rare for it to happen that way, and I think the issue is buying quota is probably a short term measure, and as we've discussed, really for a business to plan ahead, it needs to secure that quota in the long term. So I think government's role in something like that would be to negotiate the access to it, and then industry's role is to decide what they want and get hold of it. I'd make a couple of points actually, which we might take for granted about, if you like, government investment in the industry, and it's more than just grants, obviously. Something that we, as I said, we do perhaps take for granted, but perhaps shouldn't, is the enforcement capacity that government provides, as well as the science that Bangor do. Obviously, the data is at the heart of long-term and sustainable management. Without that, we really wouldn't be in that position, and so government fund that. And obviously, the more successful you get, the more people you attract within reasons. We've taken measures to limit that, obviously, but enforcement becomes an important part of any fisheries management, and that's a substantial asset for the department, or for the government in general, and is a requirement for any responsible management system.
And certainly in terms of enforcement, even in recent months, we've seen quite significant fines handed out to people. So is this a change in terms of the department's approach, or is this just the people who hear the cases taking a greater interest and putting in heftier fines?
I think it's important that the legislative system takes it seriously. if the penalties for breaking the rules were minimal and showed no disincentive, then that would be a bad thing. And I know, again, over time, I think that the seriousness of fisheries offences has been emphasised by the department in its engagement with the AGCs. But obviously, those two things are completely independent and should remain so. So the department does its role in enforcing the legislation and as necessary, bringing cases in front of the legal system, but the legal system does its own.
Yeah. So just to clarify the role of the department in that area, it's we create the regulations. The regulations dictate the rules. The enforcement team go out to observe whether the rules are being complied with, and if they're not, then they collect evidence of non-compliance. The AGCs then determine whether it's a sufficient offence to then take to court to prosecution, and the courts themselves are independently, quite rightly, independently responsible for setting the penalties. So the department's role in that process actually ends pretty early on, but the severity of the fines, has been noted in the press. I guess, it'd be completely inappropriate for, I think, any of us to really comment on that here, but one thing I would say is that, I've been contacted by fishing organisations in the UK, and they've asked the question of how do you get your courts to take this seriously, because they're finding it very challenging actually to have broad compliance, good compliance, and once somebody starts breaking the rules, then it sets an unhelpful precedent, especially if there is no real penalty for breaking the rules.
I think you're right. I think there's no point in having management proposals and trying to improve a fishery if you can't enforce it, and it is a considerable cost to the department. But the other thing I should mention, there's one thing I didn't mention before, is the fact that the assistance we get from government, as I said, is in different ways, and one of the ways is through the banker contract, and without that we wouldn't have the science to be able to do what we're doing. So I'm not belittling what support the government give. It's done in different ways, but I think going forward we do have an ageing fleet, and if we get quoted, we do need assistance, and perhaps the processors will also need assistance going forward. But I think all of those things will bring more money back into the island. So I think it's a positive step that we're talking about this.
And I'm hoping for a positive note, because we are within a few minutes of the end of the programme. How confident, Dave, obviously you're speaking for the industry to a certain extent, how confident are you in the coming, I suppose, 5, 10, 20 years for the Manx fishing industry?
Right, well, we've got, in terms of the highest earning fishery, the king scallop, we've got this long-term management plan in place. And as we said before, if we do get some good recruitment, and there are very good signs out there at the moment that there is a good level of juveniles in a lot of areas around the Isle of Man, then the industry should be profitable going forward. And with the number of boats at the right level, then it should be to such a level that we actually can afford to have more crew, because we're on skeleton crew at the moment. And we should also benefit from young people coming into the industry, like you said about Isla Gale. We've got a number of other people of that age coming into the industry, all basically from fishing families. But we'd like to be in the situation whereby people outside the traditional fishing families are interested in a career in fishing. And we're certainly in the right place with king scallops going forward. And the other fisheries will follow, no doubt. So I am far more positive than I was when I first came to this industry 8 years ago. Far more positive.
Well, what better way to finish the programme? That was Isabel Bluer, Peter Duncan, David Beard and Jack Emerson. There are great opportunities to reinvigorate our fisheries, it seems. And maybe we will go back to spuds and herring. Please get in touch with Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on this programme, and let me know what you would like me to talk about in future shows. But for now, I'm Phil Gorn. Goramayo Sungeishtak Rom. Thanks for listening.